It started on a Tuesday morning. I was walking out of a corner diner in my hometown, dressed casually in sweats and a hoodie, just trying to enjoy my leave. After 3 tours overseas, you'd think I'd be allowed a quiet breakfast without trouble. But that wasn't the case. 2 local officers were parked across the street, chatting in their cruiser. As soon as I stepped out, they locked eyes on me. I noticed it, just like I always notice details. It's what kept me alive in the field. They pulled out slowly and then cut across traffic to pull up in front of me. I kept my hands visible. Old habit. I was calm. I said, "Morning, officers." One of them stepped out, hand already near his holster. "You fit a description," he said without blinking. I smiled politely. "That's interesting," I said. "I've heard that one before." The second officer got out and circled behind me. "Let's see some ID." I pulled my wallet slowly and handed over my military ID. Name's Marcus Reeves. Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. They barely glanced at it. "This could be fake," one of them muttered. The cuffs came out fast. I didn't fight, didn't yell. I just stood there while they slapped cold steel around my wrists in broad daylight, right in front of the diner windows where people had started to record. No charges, no explanation. Just humiliation. But they had no idea who I really was, or who was coming next. I sat in holding for 6 hours before they even told me what the charge was, interfering with an investigation. I asked what investigation. They didn't answer. Just smirked. The next day, I was ordered to appear in municipal court. A public defender I'd never met was assigned. He looked overwhelmed, buried in a stack of manila folders. When I walked into that small courtroom, wrinkled uniform shirt, cuffs from the station still leaving red marks on my wrists, the officers were already seated. Laughing. Whispering. One pointed at me and chuckled. To them, I was just some guy who looked like he didn't belong where I was. The judge barely looked up when my name was called. Marcus Reeves. Charged with obstruction. State your plea. I stood straight. My voice was calm. Not guilty, Your Honor. The officers' smirks grew wider. One of them leaned back like he was watching a show. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. People turned. So did the judge. And then, everything changed. Because the man who walked in wasn't just anyone. It was General Alden Wright, 4-star General of the United States Marine Corps. Combat veteran. Decorated leader. My former commanding officer. He didn't knock. Didn't ask to be recognized. He just walked to the front row, and stood. "Permission to address the court," he said in a deep, level voice that froze the room. Even the judge looked rattled. "Granted," she said cautiously. The general turned, slowly, and looked the arresting officers straight in the eye. "You detained Gunnery Sergeant Reeves?" he asked, voice cold. Neither of them spoke. He stepped closer. "Do you have the slightest idea who you put your hands on?" The courtroom was dead silent. General Wright took another step toward the defense table. You could feel the shift in power, like a battlefield where one side suddenly realizes they've picked the wrong fight. "I commanded this man," the general said, his eyes still locked on the 2 officers. "In Helmand Province. In Mosul. In Kandahar. He's led classified operations, saved American lives, and done things that would paralyze most of you in fear." He turned to the judge. "This man," he said, motioning to me, "was awarded the Navy Cross. Twice. He has over 24 commendations for valor. And you allowed him to be cuffed like a petty criminal, without a single charge backed by evidence." The judge straightened in her chair, clearly caught off guard. The prosecuting attorney shuffled papers, trying to act like they weren't sweating. "Your Honor," General Wright continued, voice low and sharp, if this is how we treat our warfighters at home, we're not just failing them. We're disgracing the flag they swore to protect. He turned back toward the gallery. I don't care what badge you wear, he said. If you can't tell the difference between a decorated Marine and a suspect with no proof of wrongdoing, then you've got no business wearing it. One of the officers, the younger one, finally spoke up. We didn't know who he was, he said defensively. The general didn't blink. That's exactly the problem, he said. Then he walked over to me, looked me in the eye, and nodded. I came because you deserve better than this, he said quietly. And because I refuse to let anyone tarnish your name. He turned to the judge. I expect this case to be dismissed. Immediately. The judge glanced down at the file in front of her, suddenly very interested in the paperwork she hadn't bothered to read earlier. She cleared her throat. Yes. After reviewing the circumstances and new information provided by General Wright, this court finds no basis for the charges. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. The courtroom stayed silent. But the silence wasn't peace, it was tension. The kind that meant reputations had just cracked. The two officers sat stiffly, no longer smirking. The younger one swallowed hard. The older officer just stared at the ground, as if hoping to disappear. General Wright wasn't finished. He turned once more, facing the judge. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Justice and the Office of the Inspector General, he said. You'll be hearing from Military Legal Affairs as well. The judge finally looked up, paling slightly. That won't be necessary, General. It already is, he replied without emotion. He then placed a firm hand on my shoulder. Come on, Marine. You've got better places to be. We walked out of the courtroom, every person in that room following us with their eyes, not out of pity, but out of sudden and stunned respect. Some even stood as we passed. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, cameras rolling. I kept walking. I didn't want a spectacle. I didn't need headlines. But General Wright stopped beside me. And in front of the microphones, he said one final sentence that would make every evening news cycle that night: Gunnery Sergeant Reeves has done more for this country than most of you could ever understand. Today, he needed no weapon, only the truth. And that was enough to win. The fallout came fast. By the next morning, the courthouse was flooded with media requests. News anchors replayed General Wright's words on a loop, framing them as a call to accountability. Social media was lit up with hashtags like #HonorOurHeroes and #JusticeForReeves. I never asked for that kind of attention, but it came anyway. Both officers were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. I wasn't surprised. What shocked me more was how many people reached out, not just veterans, but everyday citizens, some even from overseas. Letters came in. Messages from Marines I hadn't heard from in years. One guy wrote, "I saw what happened in court. You didn't flinch. That's leadership. That's Reeves. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need someone to pay. What I needed was acknowledgement, that dignity doesn't come with conditions. That respect shouldn't have to be earned twice." Weeks later, I got a quiet invite from the mayor's office. They wanted to host a ceremony, offer a formal apology. I declined. Instead, I asked for something else: mandatory training for local law enforcement on veteran recognition, de-escalation, and cultural respect. It passed. That meant more to me than any award. General Wright and I eventually sat down over coffee, no cameras, no speeches. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah. I'm used to fighting battles. Just didn't expect one in my own backyard." He stared at me for a long second. "You didn't fight this one alone." I looked him in the eye and said, "I know. And I'll never forget that. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from those who refuse to stay silent, no matter how many stars they wear. A few months passed. I stayed off the grid for a while, spent time with family, reconnected with a few brothers from my last deployment, even started mentoring local youth who were thinking about joining the service. I didn't wear my medals. I didn't talk about the courtroom. But word still got around. One afternoon, I got a call from a woman named Teresa who ran a local outreach program for returning veterans. She said something that stuck with me, "Marcus, what happened to you? People need to hear it. Not just because of the shock. Because of what it teaches." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a public speaker. I was a Marine, not a microphone guy. But I showed up to the center anyway. And when I stood in front of 30 young men and women, some in ROTC, some struggling to reintegrate after deployment, I realized something: my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was theirs too. It was every veteran who ever got looked at sideways in their own country. Every soldier who felt invisible once the uniform came off. Every citizen who carried silent pride behind a quiet demeanor, and got misjudged for it. I started talking. And for the first time, they really listened. I told them the truth: you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to fight every time, just the right time. And when that time comes, don't back down. Because even the strongest warriors need someone to stand with them. They stood and applauded. Not because I was some hero in a headline, but because I finally turned that one painful day into purpose. And that day, I found something even more powerful than rank or reputation: a new mission. While I had moved forward, the officers who detained me hadn't escaped the storm so easily. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation. The bodycam footage showed everything: how I complied, how they ignored my ID, how they escalated for no reason. And the video taken by a diner customer? That went viral. Millions of views. No context needed, just truth, plain and sharp. Public pressure mounted. The city council held emergency meetings. People showed up with signs, not screaming for punishment, but demanding accountability and reform. Eventually, the department issued a public statement: "We acknowledge procedural failure and are initiating mandatory retraining for all officers regarding veteran interaction, identification protocols, and public conduct." One officer resigned. The other was suspended without pay, pending further review. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about setting a line so the next man doesn't get crossed. But I did receive a letter, anonymous, and signed. Postmarked from the city precinct. It read, "We messed up. You didn't deserve that. We learned the hard way. But we learned." That meant more than I expected. I folded it up, tucked it into my old field journal, and went back to work helping those who wore the same boots I did. Because in the end, I wasn't just a sniper or a case number. I was a man who stood tall when it mattered, and walked out of that courtroom with more than freedom. I walked out with purpose. It's been a decade since that courtroom. 10 quiet years. No headlines. No viral clips. No microphones. Just life, simple, steady, and earned. I now run a nonprofit called Precision Purpose. We help veterans transition from combat zones to communities. Job training, mental health resources, leadership programs. No red tape, no politics. Just real support, built from the same grit that carried us through the battlefield. And every year on the anniversary of that day, when I stood in court cuffed like a criminal, I get a letter. Same envelope. Same handwriting. Always unsigned. Still learning. Still listening. Still changing. Whoever writes it, they never say more. But they don't have to. Because real change doesn't come loud. It comes steady. General Wright retired 2 years ago. Sent me a coin engraved with just one word: honor. I keep it in my pocket when I speak at high schools or meet with new recruits. I don't tell them the full story anymore. Just enough. Enough to remind them that titles fade, uniforms come off, and sometimes your hardest fight won't be overseas, it'll be in your own backyard. But if you stand with truth, you won't stand alone. You'll always find someone who walks in right when it matters. And if you're lucky, maybe one day, you'll be the one walking in. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for a veteran scholarship program we just launched, I noticed a name that stopped me cold. E. Connors. I squinted. The cover letter was handwritten. Thoughtful. Humble. It read, "My father used to be a police officer. He made mistakes. Big ones. He left the force and never spoke about them, except one. He always told me about a Marine he wrongfully arrested, and how that moment changed his life. That Marine helped him see everything differently. My father passed last year, but his story changed mine too. I want to serve, but the right way." I leaned back in my chair. I didn't need confirmation. I knew exactly who his father was. I sat with the letter for a long time. Then I smiled. Because that was it, wasn't it? The real finish line. Not the courtroom victory. Not the apology. Not even the nonprofit. Legacy. One action had rippled forward, reshaping a life I'd never touched directly, until now. We awarded E. Connors the full scholarship. No hesitation. And when he showed up at our center weeks later, nervous and hopeful, he didn't know who I was. I didn't tell him. I just shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "Your father was braver than most. Not because he wore a badge, because he changed." He nodded, a little confused. "But someday he'll understand. Because that's what true service does, it moves through generations, in silence and in strength, long after the war is over." Years later, on a quiet Veterans Day morning, I stood alone at Arlington National Cemetery. Not for a speech. Not for a photo op. Just to visit the names that never made it home. I placed a small flag near the stone of Sergeant Pierce, my spotter, my brother. He always told me, if one of us gets to grow old, we better do something with it. So I did. As I stood, lost in thought, I heard footsteps behind me. Crisp. Steady. I turned, and there stood General Wright. Much older now. Slower. But still sharp as steel. He didn't say anything. Just walked up beside me, took off his cover, and saluted the headstone. Then, without turning, he spoke, "You did good, Gunny." I nodded, voice thick. "Tried to." He smiled faintly. "No. You did. You changed more than you'll ever know." Then he looked at me. "The day I walked into that courtroom, I did it to defend your name. But truth is, you've honored mine every day since." We stood there in silence. Two soldiers. No uniforms. No rank. Just two men who'd fought for something that mattered. When he turned to leave, he paused and gave one last nod. And in that moment, I realized, the salute wasn't just for Sergeant Pierce. It was for me. For every burden I carried. For every battle I didn't choose. For every time I stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. That day, I didn't feel like a victim. Or even a hero. I just felt whole. Because when the truth finally wins, it doesn't shout. It salutes.